The Catholic Church has long positioned itself as the gatekeeper of morality, championing celibacy, purity, and spiritual discipline. But behind monastery walls, beneath starched collars, and under the gaze of painted saints lie centuries of whispers, rumors of secret pregnancies, hidden abortions, and same-sex relationships among those who vowed to forsake such things. This video is not about scandal for scandal's sake. It's about truth. Documented, undeniable, deeply human truth, rooted in court records, papal decrees, personal letters, and the testimonies of the Church's own members. Welcome to Religious Shock. Subscribe, because religion isn't always what they told you. In the medieval world, thousands of young girls were sent into convents, not always by choice. Families unable to afford dowries would offer daughters to the Church. A girl as young as 8 or 9 might become a novice nun, trained in obedience, silence, and spiritual service. But the convent was not always a place of peace. It was a prison for some, and a hidden sanctuary for others. Historical records show that romantic and sexual relationships among nuns were far more common than the Church admits. In 1475, the nuns of the convent of St. Catherine in Nuremberg were investigated after several were found engaging in sexual acts with each other. In letters and confessions, some nuns spoke of spiritual sisterhoods that often crossed into romantic territory, intense emotional and physical bonds hidden from superiors. Worse still were the stories of priests who had access to these women, especially during confession. There are documented cases from Spain, France, and Italy where priests sexually exploited young novices, sometimes resulting in pregnancy. If discovered, the girls were often blamed. The priest quietly transferred or protected. When pregnancies occurred, abortions were not unheard of. Secret herbs, potions, and even surgical procedures were administered within the convent walls. Some nuns gave birth in silence and buried the newborns in unmarked graves. Others were forced to abandon their children entirely. The Church rarely punished the men, but the women, they were often excommunicated or worse, accused of witchcraft or heresy. Medieval monasteries were all-male communities, isolated and self-contained. Brothers lived together, prayed together, worked together, and sometimes fell in love. Historical letters between monks revealed deep emotional connections that often blurred into romantic or sexual relationships. Saint Elred of Rievaulx, a 12th century abbot, wrote of spiritual friendship with such intensity that some historians believe he was describing a form of same-sex love. He once wrote, "There are some with whom our soul is one, with whom we rest as in God." While not all relationships were physical, some clearly were. Inquisition records from the 13th and 14th centuries show monks accused of sodomy, sometimes in pairs, sometimes in secret cults within abbeys. One 14th century document from France describes 2 monks who were discovered lying together naked as man and wife. They were publicly flogged. One was exiled, the other executed. Yet even in this, the Church's response was not always consistent. Sometimes the men were simply moved to another monastery. Other times they were sentenced to silence, isolation, or intense fasting. But always, the shame was buried. The Church needed to preserve its reputation more than it needed to address the root of the behavior. The abuse of young boys by clergy is not a modern phenomenon. It has roots going back centuries. In medieval times, altar boys and choir boys lived in close quarters with older priests. They were trained to serve in Mass, clean the chapel, and sometimes travel alone with clergy. It created the perfect environment for grooming and exploitation. The 11th century canon law text known as the Decretum Gratiani even included rules about clerics who committed sodomy with boys. It condemned the act, but also instructed bishops to handle the matter privately, lest scandal arise. Scandal, not justice, was the concern. In 1532, the Holy Roman Empire's Carolina Code officially criminalized sodomy, yet church-run courts often operated separately from secular law, and many cases never reached public trials. By the Renaissance, the Vatican had an entire office called the Holy Office of the Inquisition. Part of its job? To investigate clergy misconduct. But instead of exposing predators, they frequently silenced victims and protected the institution. There are documented cases from as early as the 1300s of boys who were molested by their confessors or choir directors. Some spoke out and disappeared. Others were labeled liars or even accused of tempting the holy men. When abuse was undeniable, abusers were sometimes sent to remote monasteries for reflection or transferred far from the scene of the crime. Rarely were they defrocked. Almost never were they imprisoned. The church's priority was not to protect the vulnerable, it was to protect itself. Behind the thick stone walls of some convents were birthing rooms. It might sound impossible. How could a place devoted to chastity also be a place where babies were born? But the truth is, nuns getting pregnant wasn't as rare as the church wants history to remember. In her book, The Nuns of Sant'Ambrogio, historian Hubert Wolff uncovered records from the Vatican's secret archives that described entire networks of abuse, secret pregnancies, and spiritual marriages within convents. In the 19th century Sant'Ambrogio convent in Rome, several nuns, some as young as 13, were impregnated by confessors and visiting priests. Other convents had graveyards with no headstones where dead infants were buried in silence. Abortions were either self-administered with herbs or assisted by midwives in secret, often leading to infection, injury, or death. Sometimes these women were punished as heretics. Sometimes they were simply erased. But what happened to the children who survived? Some were taken in by orphanages quietly operated by the church. Others were handed to local families in return for donations. Many never knew who their real parents were, or that their father was a priest and their mother a cloistered nun. These children, born of sin in the eyes of the church, often lived their lives under the shadow of shame, despite being the victims of the system that created them. Let's be clear, not every priest or nun committed these acts, but when abuse did occur, the church's response was rarely justice. It was containment. In 1612, in a small town in southern Italy, a priest named Father Antonio was accused by multiple families of abusing their sons during catechism lessons. Local records show that rather than defrocking or punishing him, he was moved to a rural mountain parish, far from any legal authority. The people in his new village were never warned. That same tactic, quiet reassignment, was used again and again for centuries. Even in the 20th century, the Vatican maintained a set of secret guidelines called Crimen Solicitationis, issued in 1962. It instructed bishops on how to handle cases where priests sexually solicited individuals during confession. It emphasized complete secrecy. Victims were not to speak. Clergy were to report only to church authorities, not civil law. Punishment? At most, internal discipline. Often, just a transfer. Survivors who spoke out were threatened with excommunication. Families were told to stay quiet for the good of the church. In many communities, the priest was the most powerful man around. His word carried divine weight. His accusers were dismissed, disbelieved, or disgraced. You might think, surely these are just rumors, but they aren't. Inquisition records from as early as the 13th century include chilling, detailed accounts of sexual misconduct extracted during trials of clergy. In 1348, a Dominican monk in Aragon confessed under interrogation that he had known flesh with boys under his training. He claimed, "The devil tempted me," and begged for a penance. In some cases, nuns wrote secret letters describing their abuse. One 15th century letter from a Spanish nun named Maria, later found in church archives, read, "He says he is my confessor, but he lays with me as a man does with his wife. I am with child. If I speak, I am damned. The light. If I stay silent, I am broken." Such letters were often intercepted or destroyed, but a few survived, forgotten in dusty shelves and locked rooms for centuries. Inquisition scribes recorded these stories meticulously, but buried them. These were not tales for the public. They were seen as spiritual disorders to be corrected, not crimes to be exposed. What's perhaps most shocking isn't just the abuse, it's how deeply silence was institutionalized. Catholic theology teaches confession and repentance, but it also teaches obedience, especially to the clergy. That obedience became a tool for control. Children were told that speaking ill of a priest was a mortal sin. Women were told that disobedience to their confessor was disobedience to God. Entire systems were built to keep abuse quiet, from church-run orphanages and convent laundries to Magdalene asylums where fallen women were locked away, forced into labor, and punished for what others had done to them. Even art reinforced this. Stained glass windows showed fiery punishments for the impure. Sermons thundered against the sins of the flesh. And all the while, behind closed doors, The very people preaching those sermons were breaking the vows they enforced. We often talk about church abuse as something that peaked in the 20th century, but it didn't start there. What happened in Boston, Ireland, Chile, and Poland in recent decades was the eruption of a volcano centuries in the making. Recent lawsuits and investigations have uncovered tens of thousands of abuse cases, some stretching back to the early 1900s, others going back even further in family stories. DNA testing is now revealing hidden children of priests and nuns, descendants whose stories were erased. The church has paid billions in settlements, but in many places, survivors still fight for recognition, and some priests, despite evidence, still walk free. What happens when an institution of holiness becomes a sanctuary for sin? The Catholic Church shaped Western civilization, its morals, its laws, its view of sexuality, and yet, inside its own walls, it broke the very commandments it taught. From secret love affairs to forced silence, from abuse of the innocent to centuries of cover-up, this is not just about scandal. It's about power, pain, and the human cost of unchecked authority. This has been Religious Shock, where we shine light on the stories history tried to bury. If you're ready to confront more truths like this, hit that subscribe button, because we're not done yet.